Welcome back into the locker room. I'm your host, Will Kronsberg, joined once again by Braden Maloy. And Braden, we're going to talk about something a little bit different. We're going to talk about sort of the athletics, or the sports events that have happened since the pandemic started everything. We remember back on March 11th of last year, the Thunder and Jazz were playing each other. Rudy Gobert tested positive right before the game, and that sort of started the panic in the sports world. We really didn't see professional sports for 2, 3, even 4 months after that. So what has it been like as a fan, even as a journalist, to see the journey that the sports world has been through in the past 13 months?
It's been an incredible year. Through my life, I'm 21 now, I've never had a year where I've not been able to watch sports. And that was crazy to not be able to turn on my TV and find a basketball game, a football game, a baseball game, soccer game, even just any kind of sporting event. It was weird not to see that. But now that since they're back, I am so excited. I am so happy. Even if we just have to cover them remotely or it's limited capacity, I am just so glad they're back and then I can watch them again.
Absolutely. Just as a fan, I was in high school when that started. I was almost to college by the time we had sports again. It was really a crazy journey as a longtime sports fan. And as I mentioned, it all started in the NBA. That Jazz Thunder game kind of started the domino effect. We only saw 1 or 2 more games that night. And then we didn't see professional basketball again until July 30th. When all of the teams went down to Orlando. They had a bubble, or I say all of the teams, 22 of the 30 teams went down to Orlando, and they had the NBA bubble that went all the way until October. What do you think was the benefit of the NBA taking a bubble format and eventually getting to their champion?
I think it really set up every other league after that. Just in my opinion, I think the NBA is probably the best well-run professional sports league we have at the moment. I think Adam Silver's doing a great job with that. But they were kind of setting the tone. They were kind of the guinea pigs. They were going in their postseason, and depending on how their bubble looked, how it ran, would set up college football or Major League Baseball. And they did a great job with that. There's nobody in the bubble tested positive throughout the entire 2 months they were in that bubble, which is incredible. Seeing you have 22 teams, that's a ton of players with staff, with entertainment crews, with hosts and all. That nobody tested positive was incredible, and I think that really just set up for the MLB to now. The MLB didn't do a bubble, but they stuck to teams they played teams that were close to them in their region wise, right. And they had neutral sites for playoff games. So I think the NBA really set the tone for the rest of the year. Now
you mentioned the MLB. And the MLB season obviously was pushed back significantly. When all of this hit, we were in spring training, kind of ramping up towards the season. They came back in July, and they only played 60 games. Like you mentioned, it was sort of a geographical division where the AL East and NL East only played games against each other, Central in both leagues, and then the West. The MLB's approach also featured a number of rule changes that we've talked about a few times. Do you think that MLB format, it wasn't a bubble, we did see some positive tests. How do you think that worked?
I think if you got to look at it, it's more of a positive. You chalk it up to more of a positive than a negative. We did have some positive tests and some teams. I remember the Cardinals had a bunch of problems, and in the last 2 weeks they had to play 20-plus games. So they had to play double headers. So there was a bit of problems there. I just think for baseball it's hard to create a bubble. I don't think that would have been possible. For basketball, they can all play on the same court or 2 to 3 courts. Baseball, you can't really go back-to-back games. One, they're long, so you can't play one game after the other. 2, you can't really play on the same field like that. So I think for the circumstances and the way the game had to be played, I think it worked out really well. We got to crown a champion, and I think it was kind of fun to watch a 60-game season. 162 games. The season just started now, and your team's on a 3-4 game losing streak. So what? You got 150 more games. 60 games, you better get it going.
Absolutely, and we saw kind of the opposite of that. We saw the Marlins go on a little bit of a run. They had a COVID outbreak early in the season. They go on a run. The Marlins make the playoffs. I think that was a big shock to all of us, and I don't know if that'll happen again for a long time. But as you mentioned, they're back to a 162-game format. Teams are taking different approaches as far as how many fans to let into the stadium. Almost all teams, I believe, are bringing in fans, but only the Texas Rangers currently have a full stadium, and it's their brand new stadium that they just opened last year. Obviously, they weren't able to open it to fans. But I want to look at a league, or a group that tried to replicate what the NBA did much later on, which would be college basketball. We are just coming off of March Madness just a few weeks ago. All of the 68 men's teams were in Indianapolis or in and around Indianapolis. They played at 6 different venues, and the women in San Antonio at 5 different venues. So do you think that it was smart, even 10 months later, for college basketball, for the NCAA to use that bubble format?
Oh, I absolutely think so. I mean, COVID is still alive, I say, in the country, and I think we're still all trying to take precautions and limit the exposure as much as we can. So there was no, I would say, kind of the all reward, no risk, really. I mean, if you do a bubble like we did, we still crown champions, everyone's good, and we're still remaining safe. Downside, if you didn't do a bubble, yeah, nobody might have gotten it, but somebody could have, and then it could have derailed the whole tournament. So there was really no reason not to do a bubble, and I think they were smart to go ahead and do it and kind of put it in 2 separate locations, have everybody stay there.
Well, sure. I mean, you look in hindsight and you realize it worked pretty well. You had a couple teams that had positive tests before the tournament, maybe in their conference tournaments. Kansas, Virginia come to mind, as well as Duke, who didn't end up making the big dance. But yeah, I mean, in hindsight, it definitely worked. But I want to look at kind of their counterparts. On the football side, football did something a little bit different. Obviously, like baseball, you can't really bubble football, especially at the college level. But the SEC did something that I think was smart. The SEC played just 10 games all in conference. The ACC played 10 games in conference and allowed for 1 non-conference game sort of in the same geographic region. I think Clemson played an in-state team. So that worked, but how well do you think that worked in contrast to some of the other sports?
I think it worked pretty well. I mean, we did have a lot of games postponed or canceled due to teams having either contract tracing or actually obtaining COVID. And I mean, that's just going to happen when you're trying to play with, you got 50-man rosters with, I mean, Power 5 teams across the country. It's going to happen. But I think they did a really good job. I think Greg Sankey and the SEC, they really took the lead on this past year. They were the first kind of conference to say, hey, we're playing this year. And then other conferences followed behind, Big Ten being the last. But I think they really, that 10-game schedule, one, I enjoyed it as an SEC fan because there was no kind of off week. You know, we have cupcake weeks where you play Mississippi Valley State or something like that, and you don't have that sense of urgency. This year with 10 SEC games, they were more competitive games every weekend. I enjoyed watching it as a fan. I think it was cool. I would like to see more conference games each year. And of course, out-of-conference games are always fun, whether it's the in-state rivalries or the big headline matchups. But I think they did a really good job of containing it this year as well as they could.
I agree, and I think one interesting thing about the college football playoff this year was, in the age of COVID, we've heard of these so-called Mickey Mouse championships. It all comes from the NBA bubble being at Disney World, but you know the Dodgers have been accused of it as well. But with Alabama winning the college football playoff this year, I don't think you can say that. They played 10 SEC games and looked dominant. They played 2 more top 4 teams in the playoff and continued to look dominant. Just our second ever undefeated college football playoff champion. I mean, that's as tough of a road to a championship as you're going to see. They didn't have any cupcakes along the road.
Absolutely. You see, go over to basketball, we're talking about where kind of we started the Lakers, kind of a Disneyland championship because players in the bubble, you know, kind of tired. Mental health is not where it should be, so you might not be facing the competition where it's at. Baseball, 60 games, you get some outliers, like we talked about, Marlins made it and all. But football, people, I mean, you were playing your competition just like a normal year. People were there. Aside from a couple of the teams missing kind of some star players in a game or so, it was essentially the entire teams that they were coming into a non-COVID season with. They came into, they're playing top, I mean, you said Bama played Florida and Georgia and Auburn and Clemson and Ohio State. They got their money's worth and proved why they were there.
Well, sure, but I want to talk about one more thing, not exactly COVID related, but it happened in that same time period, and that's, of course, the way that social justice and sports have intersected over the past year. We saw in May, even before May, but May was the main thing, George Floyd's killing in Minnesota. We saw that had effects in the MLB when they eventually started playing, and in the NBA. How do you think social justice and sports intersecting has worked in the sports world the past year?
I think it's gotten much better. I'll tell you, I recently just did a project here about a player in the NBA, Craig Hodges, who tried to do this back in the early 90s, and his goal was to get the star players of the NBA to use their platform to speak out on these social injustices. He was not successful, but however, I think his message inspired that next generation, which is the generation we have now with LeBron James and Chris Paul and players like this that are taking that high-profile star platform and using it to better these communities, whether it's donating or charity, but also using it to speak out on social injustice because it's wrong. And they realize that, and they realize they hold a power. All these athletes hold power to it, and their words mean something. And I think it's incredible that they are taking the time to not just focus on the sport that they play, but also on the society that they live in, because they are a part of it as well.
I think it's very important. You hear that stick to sports idea, and it just doesn't really flow because these athletes are really leaders in our community, and they kind of set the agenda for the rest of the country. And that'll do it for us on The Locker Room. For Braden Maloy and all of our guests this year, I'm Will Kronsberg. Thank you so much for watching.